Hamas knew full well the reaction its murderous rampage against innocents would provoke. They knew, and they didn't care.
That's what it sounded like just a few months ago. It was former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney speaking to the World Jewish Congress in New York, where he got their Theodor Herzl Prize, their highest tribute, recognizing his half-century of unwavering support for Israel and for fighting anti-Semitism and standing with the Jewish people. Mulroney was an English-speaking Irish Catholic from a small paper mill town called Baie-Comeau in Quebec. He didn't know anybody Jewish until he went to boarding school in New Brunswick, and then he met two more at law school in Quebec City. But it was really in the 1960s when he established his law practice in Montreal that he began to meet Jewish leaders and saw they flourished in Quebec after the Holocaust. And he couldn't understand the deeply ingrained scorn for Jews present in the highest echelons of Quebec society. During the Six-Day War, Mulroney donated money to help Israel and vowed that if he ever made it to Parliament, he would fight on the home front for the Jewish community. After Pierre Trudeau resigned as Prime Minister in 1984, Mulroney swept to victory as Canada's 18th Prime Minister. He had the largest election landslide the country has ever seen. And he kept his promise. In 1989, he even invited Chaim Herzog, the former president of Israel and father to the current president, Isaac Herzog, to address a joint session of Parliament and Senate, the first Israeli leader to get that honor.
Israel is a monument to the indomitable spirit of man.
You, Mr. Prime Minister, have been a tried and trusted friend of our people and of our country over the years. As a statesman,
Mulroney's speech in November would be his last public address. He was very sick. His friends say he had prostate cancer. But he rallied that night and delivered a powerful indictment of what Hamas did to Israel on October 7th, recapped why he remained so furious at Canada's shameful historic record of its treatment of Jews during the 1930s and 40s and the Holocaust, and he gave his last plea for what government and citizens alike today should be doing to protect Jews.
For all the criticisms that have been made of Brian Mulroney over the years, and some are fair and some are unfair, when it came to issues involving Jews and the Jewish community and their level of competence and commitment and determination, he stood firm.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Monday, March the 4th, 2024. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, sponsored by Metropia. Since Brian Mulroney's death last week in Florida after a fall at the age of 84, many commentators and world leaders have been calling him one of Canada's greatest prime ministers. They point to his opening of free trade with the United States, his environmental treaties that stopped acid rain from destroying rivers and lakes, and also for the principled stance he took against apartheid in South Africa. But on today's episode, we look at Mulroney's legacy through the Jewish lens. And we'll hear from several leaders who knew Mulroney well, both his public side and his personal side. First, I'm joined by philanthropist Charles Bronfman. He counted himself as one of Mulroney's close friends. The Bronfmans and Mulroneys are neighbors, both in Montreal and in Florida. Charles Bronfman joins me now from Palm Beach. So before we go into some of the more policy things, I read that he sang at your wedding to your late wife, Andrea. Is that true? And can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, he did. We had a driveway. We put a tent over the driveway. And around 11 o'clock at night, Brian Mulroney did sing.
So can you tell us what he sang?
Well, of course, when Irish eyes are smiling.
And when Irish eyes are smiling. Beginning. Sure.
And I think he sang it with my father-in-law, who was Scots, by the way. I was not that close to him when he was prime minister. I mean, we knew each other, we were friends. He had a great romance with our family. I became friendly with him really in Palm Beach. And so he invited my wife, Rita, and I to Christmas dinner every year. And he had many of his old friends and her old friends. And I would laugh when I'd leave them. I said, "Now you guys have to stay up all night and go to church. We're going to bed."
I'm interested as well in why you said when you had your conference in 2011 at McGill University, it was said that he was one of the most acknowledged or underappreciated prime ministers. Why do you, or did you, and do you still feel that way?
Absolutely. I think that, as a matter of fact, I told Mila this the other day, that next to John A. Macdonald, he was the best prime minister Canada's ever had. What he accomplished in those 9 years is ridiculous. It's so good. And I think it will be forever a tribute to him that he had the courage to do things that were not widely appreciated at the time, but have worked to Canada's better interests.
I mean, we've heard a lot about the free trade and we've heard about acid rain. Those are for the other media to talk about. But we've heard a lot about his support for the Jewish community. Do you know why it was so important to him?
Yes, well, I went to see him a couple of times on community business and or on Israel business, but I never asked him why. Maybe it's because he was of the English minority in Baie-Comeau and he liked minority people. Maybe he just respected the heck out of the Jewish community and the Jewish people. He had pulled himself up by the bootstraps. Maybe he enjoyed that about Jews who had done the same thing.
He appointed you as a member of the Privy Council in 1992. How did that come about?
He called me one evening and he asked me if I would do this. And I said, no, I don't want to do it. And he said, why? I said, Brian, you're a very, very kind man. And you're doing this because you think certain people deserve it. I, on the other hand, think that maybe this could be abused. And he said, well, Paul Desmarais and Conrad Black have already agreed. So I said, I'm the Jewish recipient, and Conrad's the WASP, Paul is the Franco one. So I have to say yes. So that's how it happened.
What is the responsibility? How did you serve as the Jewish member of the PCO from 1992?
Zero. I mean, it's just an honorary position. It doesn't mean anything.
When I grew up in Montreal, if you were Jewish, you voted Liberal. That was it. It was tradition. And then he came on the scene and was the new leader. How did you take him as a PC who was very supportive of the Jewish community?
I had always voted Liberal until he came along. And I think I even voted John Turner the first time because John was a friend. And I didn't know this Mulroney man. I think the Jewish community was skeptical. And then I think most of us backed him.
And how did he win the community over? How did he win you over?
I think that he made the right speeches at the right time in the right places. He's a very, very bright man, very astute, understood how to win people over. I mean, I think that Brian Mulroney was a great, great man. He was kind, he was thoughtful, he was concerned very much with the issues of the day, and he was not a bystander.
You were in New York, were you not, in November when he got the award for the World Jewish, the Herzog Award?
Actually, my wife had a lot to do with it. I'll tell you the story. He and his wife and Mila and Joe Carroll and Ronald Lauder and Rita and I had dinner. And apparently the next day, Joe Carroll said, this Mulroney man, he's really terrific and he loves Jews and so on. Rita said yes. And she said, I think he should get the award. Now, Ronald, her husband, is the chairman of the World Jewish Congress. And the next thing you know, there's an invitation to Brian to win the award. So we all paraded to New York, and he got up on his spindly legs and got somehow to the podium and gave this rousing speech, really a great defense of Israel. He hated anti-Semitism. He just despised the idea that people would band together just because of religion. And he was a religious Catholic.
His son, Ben, we know that he married a Jewish woman from Montreal, the Brownstein's daughter, Jessica. So are his grandchildren Jewish? Like Trump Jewish grandchildren?
I believe he does.
Professor Don Abelson was hired to run the former Prime Minister's Legacy Project, an institute teaching government and public policy at St. Francis Xavier University. It's in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, where Mulroney had gone to school. It's a Catholic university, and the institute is kind of Canada's answer to how the U.S. presidents set up libraries after they leave office. Abelson and a colleague published a scholarly paper on Mulroney's views on Jews. It covers his 9 years in office, as well as inside and outside public life, and Mulroney's long-standing disgust for his predecessor Pierre Trudeau's anti-Semitic views, which the former Prime Minister had held as a much younger man, including writing plays supporting fascism and views that Jews should be kept out of Canada. Professor Abelson joins me now, along with Stephen Adler, the CJN's political panelist and longtime Conservative Party insider.
Great to be with you.
Thanks for having me.
Not too many people know that Brian Mulroney has an institution in a university in Nova Scotia with his name on it that a Jewish guy ran. But it's kind of fitting in a way, based on your research, that that would be the case.
When Brian Mulroney found out that I was the person selected, he kindly invited me to meet with him at his Montreal law firm, which I did. And it got to a point in the discussion, and he said, well, Don, I've been thinking long and hard about this, but what is the hook? How are we going to get students into this small rural campus? And I looked at him and I said, coming up with a narrative isn't going to be difficult because, in effect, it's about your life story. A young man who started at St. X when he was 16 years old in the fall of 1955, came from, a very modest background. His father was an electrician. He attended St. Thomas High School in Chatham, New Brunswick for high school, a boarding school. His parents could barely afford to send him there, but they realized he had considerable potential and they wanted to give him every opportunity. It was at St. Thomas High School when he had the opportunity to meet the first Jewish person of his life. Growing up in Baie-Comeau, Quebec, a small town on the North Shore of the St. Lawrence River, there were no Jews. And he met the son of a haberdasher who he became friends with. And later on in life, when he attended Laval University, that's when his exposure to more Jews happened. And then, of course, as a lawyer practicing in Montreal, a new world was about to open to him.
How did the Jewish community vote before Brian Mulroney came to power?
The flavor was liberal. I grew up in Hamilton, and my dad was a conservative, but conservative supporters in the Jewish community were the outliers. Through Brian Mulroney's time, we look at the Jewish community now, and we're well ingrained with the federal Conservative Party, but it hasn't always been that way. Brian Mulroney was a rock star in Canadian politics, but our community, Ellen, did not overwhelmingly support Brian Mulroney and the Progressive Conservatives. Brian Mulroney started to change the way the Jewish community thought of partisan politics at the federal level.
How did he do that?
So I think he recognized, and look, I wasn't in the room at the time, but I think he was a strong supporter of the state of Israel. He launched the Duchesne Commission about Nazi war criminals in Canada. I don't think he did either of those things to get votes. I think he did it because they were the right thing to do. Prime Minister Mulroney was a principled individual who saw right and wrong and tried to correct the wrong. And I think that appeased and appealed to many different communities across Canada who saw someone like them starting from humble beginnings, rising up to become the leader and prime minister and hold the highest office in our land. I think a lot of people saw themselves in it, especially immigrant communities who came with nothing to Canada.
Okay, over to you, Don. You wrote this incredibly timely paper.
On the right side of history.
On the right side of history. We put the link to it in our show notes. You decided that there was a gap in studies about Prime Minister Mulroney.
Well, this was a paper that my partner, Monda Halpern, and I wanted to delve into because, as you rightly point out, so much has been written about Brian Mulroney. But what people often overlook is the social impact that he had. You know, he could never understand why Jews were targeted. And he looked across the civil service, saw very few Jews. He looked at high-level cabinet appointments, next to no Jews. And he thought to himself, how is it possible that these wonderful people, hardworking, committed citizens of Canada have been treated and mistreated the way they have? And so throughout his career, both in office and out of office, he made it his point, indeed he made it his mission, to flag his concerns about rising anti-Semitism at every opportunity. He was recognized by every major Jewish group, not only in Canada, but abroad. He felt this very strong bond and attachment. It disgusted him when he read about how Jews were treated during the 30s by Vincent Massey and others, by Mackenzie King. And he just, as Stephen rightly pointed out, wanted to be on the right side of history.
I mean, it's actually much more than that. It's a bit of shame and guilt, even though he had nothing personally to do with it. But when you read his speeches, he said,
I promised myself that if I were ever in a position of leadership, I would do what I could to lift some of the stain from our national character, left from that time in the 1930s when we abandoned the Jewish people at the very time in their history when they most needed our protection.
And I agree with the comment that Stephen made earlier. You know, Brian Mulroney did not court Jewish communities out of political expediency. We represented such a small, and continue to, such a small fraction of the electorate. He did it because it was the right thing to do. And we often talked about the Holocaust, and he said, Don, to this day, I cannot watch scenes of the Holocaust. I can't bring myself to it. And to imagine what the Jewish people have been through, and then once again to be scapegoated in the way that they have over the last several months and years, it physically made him ill. So he felt very, very passionate about the state of Israel. He felt very passionate about Jewish communities across the country. And I think it's one of the many things that he should be admired for.
During the speech that he gave in New York in November at this World Jewish Congress, where you mentioned is one of his last speeches, he railed against the way Israel has been turned into the new Jew. I like the way he said that, with all the progressive left-wing people now coming out of the woodwork. What were you, when you wrote your paper about his position on Israel, you know, what strikes you the most? Because, for example, Prime Minister Mulroney and Stephen Harper had different reasons for supporting Israel. One was more religious.
You know, Brian Mulroney, on more than one occasion, did express, support and sympathy for the plight of the Palestinians. There's no question about that. But he felt, first and foremost, that Israel, as a sovereign state, had a sovereign right to protect itself, protect its borders, protect its people. That it had a fundamental right to exist, and it was Canada's obligation as a democratic state to help ensure Israel's survival. On that point, he was unequivocal. Of course, would he have preferred to have seen a more peaceful resolution in the Middle East? There is no doubt. But for Mulroney, it was about doing whatever Canada could and should to ensure the territorial and physical integrity of the Jewish state of Israel. And on that, he never wavered. Mulroney had no trust for foreign affairs. And Mulroney made it very, very clear to career diplomats at External Affairs that he would not tolerate the kind of anti-Semitic sentiments that had taken root in that particular department and had emboldened civil servants for so many years.
So in 1984, by then I was leader of the opposition, when the Pierre Trudeau government invited the Palestine Liberation Organization's UN representative to be heard in the Canadian Parliament, at a time when the PLO was officially designated as a terrorist organization. I called the Israeli ambassador and told he was in sickbed. I said, I don't give a hell what he is. I want him out of the sickbed now. Come to my office in Parliament, and we are both going to denounce and eviscerate the government and the PLO.
You wrote in your paper that he considered Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, an anti-Semite.
Yeah, I think the term he actually used was nothing but a goddamn anti-Semite. And I provide, I think, a very colorful quote about Trudeau making a comment that Jews in Canada pose a greater threat than German tanks rolling across Europe. That's quite an observation. It was interesting with Mulroney. He went through this metamorphosis when he was a young man in school at St. FX at the time as an undergraduate, and sent a letter to Pierre Trudeau, who was a professor in law at the University de Montreal, asking him for his advice about a particular topic. And when Mulroney became aware of many of the things that Trudeau had said, many of the things that Trudeau believed in, particularly with respect to the Jewish community in Canada, Mulroney went out of his way to distance himself. So I wanted to capture, Mont and I wanted to capture really the spirit of Mulroney's feelings about Trudeau. You know, I learned very early on as director of the Mulroney Institute certain names not to bring up in his company. One was Trudeau, of course, one was Lucien Bouchard, and I was very pleased to hear that they reconciled shortly before Mr. Mulroney's passing. But there were a handful of names that would trigger a very visceral response. That was one. And that was an interview that was conducted, less than 2 years ago. He was very vocal. And I mentioned to him at the time that, sir, this is going to be incorporated into our paper. He said, well, goddamn right it's going to be incorporated, because that's exactly what happened. So he rarely shied away from things like this, but he had absolute and utter disdain for Pierre Elliott Trudeau's attitudes towards Canadian Jews. It sickened him.
What do we know about, you mentioned earlier that he made a point and went out of his way, Stephen, maybe you can weigh in on this too, to hire and appoint respected Jewish people to very senior jobs, right? His right-hand man, and then in the diplomatic corps. How important is this for the Jewish glass ceiling, I guess we would call it?
So I think Prime Minister Mulroney hired the most competent people to the most senior jobs. I think it is amazing that Stanley Hart and Hugh Segal both served in such senior roles in the Prime Minister's office, being Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister. This is a Prime Minister who surrounded himself with competent, good people who didn't give him the advice he wanted to hear, gave him the advice he needed to hear. Hugh Segal was a huge progressive conservative, having worked for Bill Davis in the Ontario government prior. And I think what's even better is that the Prime Minister hired them because of what they could do for Canada, not because they happen to be Jewish Canadians.
What about the story, though, with, listen, Eddie Goldenberg was Jean Chrétien's chief of staff, another Jewish guy, but in the liberal side. But what about Norman Spector? Why was the decision to make Norman Spector the first Canadian Jewish ambassador to Israel so key?
Yeah, that was critical. And of course, Norman Spector was also one of Mulroney's chiefs of staff. So 3 Jewish chiefs of staff in a row. Norman Spector had decided that after serving government for a number of years and working so closely with Brian Mulroney that he was going to leave government. And the next morning, Mulroney called him into his room and he said, Norman, I'm sad to see you go. What is it that you would like to do? And he said, well, sir, I don't know the point of saying this, but I would love, if the universe was a little different, to be Canada's first Jewish ambassador to Israel. But I know, given the attitude at Foreign Affairs, they have never permitted that because of their feeling that we would have dual loyalties. And Mulroney heard him out and said, well, that's about to change. Mulroney placed a phone call to the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, basically said, do you have a list of people you were considering for the next Canadian ambassador to the State of Israel? They said, yes, sir, we do. He goes, great, I've got another name for that list, and he's at the top of the list, and he's my choice, and it's Norman Spector. And that was such a brave decision. And you talk about breaking the glass ceiling, it shattered the glass ceiling. So, as he often said, in the fullness of time, history will judge what my government did. I think we, as Jews, should be very, very proud of what he did for our community and for the state of Israel.
Stephen, you are in touch with a lot of people in the Conservative Party that are no longer in power, but still very closely tied. How is it playing with people who grew up in the Conservative ranks with him?
A lot of us who came to understand politics and got involved in politics in the 80s and through the Mulroney years, we were first shocked to hear the news that he had passed. And I think to a person, he was a mensch, and he's remembered as a leader and a mensch. But he's also remembered for doing little things. And some of the stories I've heard recently are, if any member of parliament in the Progressive Conservative caucus, the Liberal caucus, the NDP caucus, then the Bloc Québécois caucus, if a child scored a goal or a child graduated from somewhere, if someone, God forbid, had passed away or something good had happened, more often than not, a little handwritten note would be on that member's desk. And it would be a mazel tov for this, or my condolences. It taught a whole generation of us how to be leaders. And that's really what's coming out of it. He was a mensch.
Don, your paper starts off with a beautiful Jewish flavor and the number 18.
Well, it's so significant, but because when we refer to Chai, it's really reaffirmation of our belief in the sanctity of life and goodness and prosperity. It was more than fortuitous, I think, that Brian Mulroney was our 18th prime minister, because to me and to many others, he signified a voice of hope and reason. And he just believed very, very strongly in issues of social justice. He did not like bullies.
I did not know, Don, about what his Prime Minister Mulroney did to help Jewish women.
One of the things he recognized, as a lawyer, was that it was certainly not fair from his perspective for Jewish men to withhold a get from their wives in the event of divorce. And so he was able to put forward reforms to the Canadian Divorce Act that would make it much easier, not on the religious side, but certainly civilly, for Jewish women to divorce their husbands and not allow themselves really to be, in some sense, victimized and controlled by husbands who were holding off in issuing a get until they were able to extract the kinds of concessions that they really wanted. He's going to be missed by a lot of people because I think we're all searching for those next leaders who will be able to discriminate between fact and fiction, those leaders who have the courage and conviction to tell people, as Stephen rightly pointed out, not what they want to hear, but what they need to know. And Brian Mulroney, for all of his faults, and there were many, stood firm when it came to the truth.
Erwin Kotler was supposed to be in New York in November at the same table as the Bronfmans to watch Brian Mulroney receive that Herzog Award, but he was under the weather and he couldn't make it. Kotler had recently stepped down as Canada's special envoy combating antisemitism. Kotler's a former Liberal member of Parliament and Liberal cabinet minister, but after Mulroney left office. But the pair had many direct ties. They were both Montrealers. They were both lawyers. And Kotler was a Jewish leader, including serving as a lawyer for freeing South African prisoner of conscience Nelson Mandela and working to free Soviet Jews, and even at the Deschênes Commission, which Mulroney created in 1985 to find out where Nazi war criminals were living in Canada. I reached Kotler in Israel.
Even Deborah Lyons, in her tweet on his passing, excerpted from his address at that New York meeting. So very principled and committed. And when he addressed the Lord Reading Law Society in Montreal several years ago, and I was there and we were together at the same table, he spoke there too.
That's the Jewish Lawyers Law Society grouping in Montreal, where my dad was president.
Where your dad was president, Zichrono Livracha, and where Mulroney spoke. And when Mulroney spoke, he devoted his address to the combating of anti-Semitism. And I thought it was an excellent address, and we, spoke there as well afterwards. So there's been a long-standing relationship, even when he ran against John Turner for the prime ministership back in 1984. I had been, a special advisor to Turner. That was my first job. And we met, through that as well, but not in an adversarial fashion, but in a friendly fashion.
I want to ask you, in terms of a personal relationship, when was the last time you were in touch with him?
The last time I was in touch with him was just before his talk in New York.
He was quite ill, but he obviously was following world events. What did he think about what was going on in Israel, Gaza now?
We didn't speak about Israel, Gaza. We just spoke about the anti-Semitism having reared its ugly head after October 7th. That it had been there before October 7th, but that it was, really alarmingly present after October 7th. And I think Mulroney was concerned about this, and that's why he spoke about it.
About the Nazi war criminals and the Recession Commission, and how Mulroney called that inquiry because he was horrified, right, by what the record of Canada was. How much are you aware of that?
I am aware of that because that's another issue on which we had discussions. I acted at the time as counsel for the Canadian Jewish Congress before the Recession Commission, and I was very critical of, the policy of Canadian government towards Nazi war criminals, which goes back to our late friend Irving Abella, who put it best. He said that after the Second World War, it was easier to get into Canada if you were a Nazi than if you were a Jew. I mean, I wrote a whole thing on this about, the Canada's inaction, if not indifference, toward the presence of Nazi war criminals in Canada. So I thought that the Recession Commission was warranted, but more importantly, the action following the Recession Commission. And that, I think, finally put in place a program to bring Nazi war criminals to justice, which was, 40 years later than it should have been, but nonetheless finally occurred.
So how should Canadian Jews remember him?
Number one, as one of the leaders in the anti-apartheid movement. He basically confronted both Thatcher and Reagan, both of whom he was friendly with, but he took the principled stand with regard to apartheid. Number two, I think he also took a principled stand with regard to the Soviet Union as it was at the time. And number three, his important condemnations of anti-Semitism. And number four is his important role with regard to the bringing of Nazi war criminals to justice. I think those are four things that both Canadian Jews and the Canadian and international community should remember him for.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily, sponsored by Metropia. Integrity, community, quality, and customer care. You should watch Mulroney's final stirring speech at the World Jewish Congress. I put the link in our show notes, and the link's also there to that scholarly paper by Professor Abelson and his colleague Manda Halpern on Mulroney and the Jews. Highly recommend both. We'll end with another bit of audio from Mulroney's final speech on Israel and what to do about anti-Semitism. Thanks for listening to the CJN Daily, and write in to me at ebessner@thecjn.ca with your comments.
Anti-Semitism, born in ignorance and nurtured in envy, is the stepchild of delusion and evil, and is a scourge that absolutely must be eradicated. It may not be stamped out in my lifetime, nor in the lifetime of my children, or even, sadly, those of my grandchildren. But as Reinhold Niebuhr reminded us, nothing worth doing is completed in our lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope. And nothing fine or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. And therefore, we must be saved by faith. I urge you all to keep the faith in the trying days to come.